Okay, so I think we are in fact live. If the messages on the screen are correct. Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine, and welcome this evening to Authors Reading Aloud. I am joined this evening by Ed Maliskas, the author of John Brown to James Brown, The Little Farm Where Liberty Budded, Blossomed, and Boogied. Ed is going to be sharing various selections with us this evening about the history that grew up around what we in our area know as the Kennedy Farm. Some of us know it as the one-time headquarters of the John Brown raid, but it has a much more deeper story with continued meaning to the civil rights movement that Ed will share with us this evening. Ed's background is in history education, and he also has a doctorate in religion. And I was excited to learn this evening that he has another book that will be available in a few weeks. And I believe he, let's see here, that was The Family Tree of R&B. Is that the title? Okay. So that sounds exciting. I'm going to pass this over to Ed now and allow him to share his work with you and his wonderful words.
Well, thank you all for joining us. As the subtitle of John Brown to James Brown suggests, The Little Farm Where Liberty Budded, Blossomed, and Boogied, there are three parts to the story, and they're all intimately connected, and perhaps more so than anything by the idea of liberty. When I first heard of the story, a man about 10 years older than I am said he used to go to dances at John Brown's farm, and they played R&B there, and he started naming names that I had clearly heard of, and after a while it was James Brown and Ike and Tina Turner and Aretha Franklin. I thought, as I asked him, I said, John Brown's farm, is this the abolitionist John Brown? And he said, I don't know, we just call it John Brown's farm. So I thought to myself at that point, boy, if this really is the abolitionist John Brown, and 100 years later the giants of R&B are playing there, there's got to be a story, and boy, was there. So the three parts are, as Catherine suggested, stated, that it was the raid headquarters for John Brown for several months before the raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. And then a century later, almost, when the civil rights movement was stuck in the mud after World War II, the Black community was looking for inspiration. And when they found out that that John Brown property was up for sale, they jumped on that. They said, this is the perfect place. This is the perfect man to provide inspiration for us to carry out this unfinished task of Brown's aspiration for the equality and fraternity of the races. And then as the Elks held that property, they rented out the property to one of their member Elks who booked all these gigantic dances. And so I like to start reading with a selection from the book. And this is a fictional character, a composite character, Sylvia. Saturday, June 27th, 1959, Charlestown, West Virginia. Beep, beep. Sylvia, a cute black 19-year-old, finishes ironing her brand new blouse. Beep, beep, beep. She quickly buttons up, braces her palms on the windowsill, and leans out from her upstairs bedroom. On the street below, her cousin Bobby stands next to her in his newly repainted 1951 Ford F1 pickup. Syl, you coming tonight or not? Of course I'm coming. We're supposed to meet up at Fisherman's Hall at 8 o'clock, right? Sylvia, it's 10 after 8 now. Everybody else done gone. Oh my gosh, yelps Sylvia in a panic. She scurries down the stairs, snatches her sweater off the handrail, and bolts towards the front door. Young lady, booms her mother from the kitchen. Sylvia skids to a halt. Who's driving? Cousin Bobby. All right then, but you tell him to get you home by 11:30. But Mama, tonight is special. That's what you always say, but it always is. Suit yourself, intervenes her father, but I'm waking you up early for Sunday school and breakfast before that. Sylvia hops into the cab with a waiting pickup and scrunches next to her cousin Mary. In the truck bed, perched on orange crates, are Sylvia's older brother Reginald and his pal Freddie, a handsome soldier home on leave. The two men in the back nearly topple over as Bobby steps on the gas and heads toward the new bridge at Harper's Ferry. The windows are rolled down on this warm summer evening as the quintet snakes its way up little Sandy Hook Road hard by the Potomac River. Bobby had been miffed at missing the convoy of vehicles leaving Charlestown, but now can't help but lighten up as Sylvia and Mary clown and sing along with the radio. Meanwhile, the guys in the back squint to make sense of the little map that her friend had scribbled out. The sun is about to set, and finding this place is notoriously difficult in the dark. Rumor has it that the KKK is active in these backwoodsy boondocks. Sylvia's getting the creeps, thinking about what might happen if they get a flat tire. Her Aunt Betty once had a flat tire at night on a little road outside Sharpsburg, and just as she bent down to reach into the glove box, bam! Sylvia screams at the sharp rap on the back window and giggles in relief as Reginald yells over the road noise, "I think we're supposed to take this here road to the right. Does this intersection look familiar? Does anybody recognize that barn?" Right then they get a major clue that they are indeed on the correct route. Gunning up behind them in a drop-top coupe de ville is a hip cat from Baltimore with processed hair and his uptown-looking girlfriend. Mary scolds playfully, "Stop staring, cousin, they'll think we're country." Sylvia laughs, "Us here riding in this pickup truck? Girl, they already know we're not from Manhattan." 300 yards up ahead, one vehicle after another is turning off the main road onto a gravel lane. "This is it, we're here." From the north come license plates from Pennsylvania and Maryland. From the south are tags from Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. A gap in the white picket fence beckons the motorists to slip under and through the 14-foot-high archway. Bobby brakes to a stop at a little booth halfway up the lane and is greeted pleasantly. "How many of you tonight?" "5," he answered. "That'll be $15. Have a good time." Mary leans across Sylvia to cackle to the ticket taker, "Oh, you know we will." Straight ahead, the amber sun is setting behind a grove of trees silhouetted at the top of the hill. Bobby guides his cherry red F1 past the auditorium and up the rise to find a place to park. A couple of guys leaning against a gray Studebaker are checking out Bobby's paint job, but Sylvia is checking out the people and what they are wearing. Off to the right stand 3 sharps from Frederick, outfitted in snazzy suits, ties, and alligator shoes. Twin girls from Hagerstown are looking fine in their matching summer sheaths and with their hair all done up. "Good thing I didn't dress down tonight," thinks Sylvia. As she and her group walk toward the dance hall, they tread oh so carefully around the plops of cow manure scattered here and there in the field. They are close enough now to hear rhythmic throbs resonating from inside the low-lying block building. A bootlegger discreetly slips open his jacket to exhibit his wares. "Maybe later," Bobby says smoothly as they pass on. Up ahead, a black sheriff's deputy keeps things commotionless as he patrols the grounds with his leashed German shepherd. Reginald warns, "Girls, stay clear of that dog. He means business." "Here, Sylvia," says handsome Freddie as he extends his elbow, "you better walk next to me." With her free hand, Sylvia gestures across the property to several girls she knows from attending Page Jackson High School. You can just bet they're asking, "Who's that handsome guy Sylvia is with?" A nice young man from Winchester, Virginia, that Sylvia danced with last summer winks in playful recognition as they all join the line at the center door. Once inside, Sylvia's eyes adjust to see the room filled with hipsters making the scene. A mirrored ball hangs from the ceiling directly above the Elks insignia regnant in the center of the dance floor. The auditorium is packed with partiers doing dances she already knows, like the Bop, the Hully Gully, and the Madison. And there will be some moves she has never seen before because the best dancers bring something fresh every week. Chairs and tables ring the outside of the rectangular room where clusters of young people talk, laugh, and line up dance partners. No wallflowers here. Several bartenders man the long, ornate bar, hustling to keep pace, serving beer and setups to folks eager to spend their hard-earned coin. In the far right corner of the room, an electrifying young entertainer dominates the event. He is on stage with his vocal group, the Famous Flames. The instrumentalists, studied with pioneering rhythm and blues musicians from Little Richard's former band, are laying down a funky groove. The singer's fancy footwork testifies that he once was an accomplished boxer. His sweat-drenched face gives credence to the claim that he is the hardest working man in show business. And his rough and earnest voice squeezes out the lyrics to an up-tempo jam that he and the Flames are soon to record. "If you leave me, oh yes, I'll go crazy, oh yes." Sylvia peers over the top of the crowded dance floor that sways in exuberant motion. The bodies part just enough for her to see James Brown twirl, drop down into the splits and pop back up again. The crowd howls in delight. The good times are rolling tonight at John Brown's farm. On hundreds of such occasions, young people throng to John Brown's farm to enjoy the rich experience and liberating atmosphere. Highlight events included the 4th of July weekend of 1954, when 3,000 souls crowded onto the property for a 3-day celebration. On Labor Day of 1965, more than 1,000 merrymakers traveled there to relax, celebrate, and dance to James Brown and his entourage playing Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and I Got You, I Feel Good. Summer after summer, the auditorium's block walls and tiled floor reverberated with the piano riffs of Ray Charles, the shouts of the Isley Brothers, the high heels of Tina Turner, the tongue trills of Billy Stewart, and the doo-wops of the Orioles and the shrieks of James Brown. Then one day, the music stopped. The echoes faded, and winter set in. Within months, the property was sold and later sold again. Years passed, 20, 30, 40. Today, that once vibrant and auditorium has become a dilapidated old hulk looming behind the authentically restored farmhouse. The former dance hall's windows have been boarded, its doors slouch on their hinges. There's been a fire. You can barely make out the faded IBP OEW insignia on the badly chipped floor. The glass ball still hangs overhead, but badly tattered. There are holes in the roof and mold in the walls, lots of mold. Each passing year left behind fewer people who knew those vivacious days at John Brown's farm. Those who once knew have forgotten some things. Some of those who once knew have forgotten everything. Somebody ought to do something before everybody forgets everything. Excuse me, ma'am, my name is Ed. I'm researching a story. Pleased to meet you, Ed. My name is Sylvia. What can I do for you? Well, would you happen to know anything about the music scene at John Brown's farm? John Brown's farm, oh, that was the place. And it was. This was a Black entrepreneurial experience, the likes of which many people cherish to this day and yearn for happening again. A Maryland state senator, Joanne C. Benson, was raised in Hagerstown and went to those dances. And she just, you can feel the love rise in her heart as she talks about John Brown's farm, about being a village, a refuge, just a place of wonder. I've talked to some people who say today, I'm in my 80s, but John Brown's farm is one of the most precious events of my lifetime. So we've got this connection between John Brown. John Brown is, for anybody who knows something about him, he is easily the most controversial person in US history. I sometimes say we've got an orange-headed president that's kind of lining up to being considered in that. But John Brown was considered by some to be a savior, others to be just a terrorist, and the gamut of opinion runs so far from left to right. But the important thing for us to understand is in the middle of the 20th century, the opinion about John Brown was that he was a great man. If they were to compare him to Abraham Lincoln, John Brown was considered superior to Lincoln because of what Brown had to sacrifice and the length of time that he spent working on this plan to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping that without the snap of a gun, he could undermine the entire slave system. This is something that Dennis Fry was useful in explaining to me, that if Brown had his way, then he would start a new nation within a nation up in the hills of Virginia and call slaves to escape and join him. And if enough of these slaves were to escape, they cost from 1 to 2 years of salary for a typical person to own a slave. And so if enough people, enslaved persons, ran away, nobody would venture to have a slave. It was too easy to lose your life's fortune. That was Brown's hope. And so in the middle, in the early 20th century, I have a book by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois was in Harper's Ferry in 1906 for the second meeting of the Niagara Convention, which eventually morphed into the NAACP. On that occasion, Du Bois and a number of the other people who showed up there in Harper's Ferry then made a pilgrimage out to the building where John Brown had been captured. It had been disassembled, taken to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, disassembled, brought back, and put on a farm near Harper's Ferry. And that group of the Niagara movement went out to John Brown's farm, and W.E.B. Du Bois was among those who took off their socks and shoes as they approached that building where John Brown had been captured, and they regarded it as holy ground. So then, as Du Bois writes his biography of Brown, that's the understanding of the Black community, that there was no greater hero, that nobody did more at a greater cost than John Brown. Then this book by W.B. Du Bois, to read someone else's work here for a bit, but he is talking, he says, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. So this is the yearning of Du Bois. He understands how Brown sought to further that. And so in 1948, when the John Brown's farm property comes up for sale, the two local Elks to this Hagerstown area bring the opportunity for that property to be bought, which the IBP OEW, the Black Elks, purchased that building. And they understand, again, what Brown has done for them. Because John Brown has been covered so much, many of you probably know more than I do, perhaps, but I would recommend that you read Du Bois's biography, John Brown, so that you can understand the Black community's regard for Brown. So the Elks buy this property because coming out of World War II, promises had been made to the Black community. The Black community was stiffed after participating in World War I. They were promised that they would be able to make advances out of Jim Crow and into full citizenship with civil rights. And then we saw the awful Tulsa race riots there in 1921. And so as we fast forward to the dawn of World War II, the Black community had a serious discussion about whether they would participate in World War II. The Elks are very patriotic. They, along with Martin Luther King Sr., who was an Elk, Martin Luther King Jr., who along with Oprah Winfrey participated in the Black Elks oratorical contests in their teenage years, understood, the Elks now that is, that if America will just believe the US Constitution with its concern for individual liberty and the common good, that if we can all agree that there is a document by which we can all live, have liberty and fellowship, then the task is complete. And so in the dedication ceremony of the Elks of John Brown's farm property in September 22nd of 1951, more than 2,000 Grand Lodge officers, brothers, daughters, and friends from lodges and temples throughout the country assembled at the historic John Brown farm near Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, to dedicate this national shrine in a two-day celebration. The purpose of this meeting was to proclaim the fact that Negroes had not forgotten and were now on the march to bring in the fulfillment of what was termed the holy mission of John Brown, that of human equality, not just legal equality, but the human equality of all men. So as the civil rights movement bogged down after World War II, the Elks said, we need inspiration. We need to look back to someone, and when they found that John Brown's farm property was for sale, they said, let's buy that. Thurgood Marshall is an Elk. The Elks had a legal department already in place, and so they met by the thousands there to scheme for civil rights legislation. So again, I've documented this fully in the book because it just has not been done elsewhere. I recently came across this book, What a Mighty Power We Can Be, by 3 Harvard authors that authenticate the role of the Black Elks. I'm going to switch over here to share a screen here for a second. There it is. The Elks were involved prior to Brown versus Board in 1954. And a sad realization to me was that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Black schools in the United States. And if Brown versus Board tore down the official line between Blacks and white school, undermining the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal fallacy, then thousands of Black administrators and tens of thousands of Black teachers were going to lose their jobs as the schools got integrated. They knew that going in, but they said, this is going to be worth it. We can't have the fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution unless we look ourselves to our own detriment financially, and even the leadership in some of our communities, to integrate these schools. So most people mark Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 as the beginning of the civil rights movement, but there was much work to be done after that. So the Elks Legal Department worked with the NAACP Legal Department, mostly through the person of Thurgood Marshall. And then once Brown versus Board goes through, the 750 to 800,000 Elks and daughter Elks in the United States, I hope you can read this, but I'll go through it quickly, that the Elks embarked on a massive voter registration drives. They began holding political offices at the local, state, and national levels. In the 1952 Republican Convention, the Mississippi delegation in 1952, the Republican National Delegation, were all Black Elks. They had finances. These were middle class to upper class Blacks in many cases, a lot of money available to them. They could move people and money around the country. When there were poll taxes and literacy tests for voter registration, the Elks would go in and have literacy programs. They lobbied Congress. They cooperated with the NAACP. The head of the Elks at that time, J. Finley Wilson, could say to senators and presidents of the United States, look, I've got 750,000 votes that I can swing either direction that I want. And politicians listened to that and made accommodations in civil rights legislation. So an important thing there. And then I think I'm going to quickly go, there's that Republican National Convention thing. You can see the Black delegation from Mississippi right under that Oklahoma sign. And they go just a little farther. This is a quote from this book that says, by reaching out to literally hundreds of thousands of members, teaching them valuable political skills, and fostering a social sensibility of racial solidarity and an understanding of civil rights activism as inherently patriotic, the IBPOEFW helped to create a mass army of dedicated, politically active African-American citizens, without which the civil rights movement would not have been possible. So the bulk of our time now, then, we will move forward from the Elks' time and John Brown's time on that farm, but hopefully to letting you see that you got arguably both the Civil War and the modern civil rights movement are going to arise from that site. Now let's see, I want to click out of here. Do I just do that? No, I don't. Oh, I know what I'm supposed to do. Uh-oh. Catherine, whoops, are you able to bring me back in? I'm doing something dopey here.
Let me try here. See if I can, you want to leave the screen share?
Oh, I see. I know what I'm doing.
Okay.
So, okay, sorry, everyone. So now we've got the situation where this black elk, John Bishop, is booking bands into John Brown's farm. And I'm going to do a reading here from the book of Getting There Was Half the Fun. One of my earliest curiosities about this story was how the patrons of John Brown's farm traveled to and from the property. I had trouble enough finding the place in broad daylight with a map in the pre-flood days before GPS. Thus, I was eager to learn how hundreds of people, some of whom came from well over 50 miles away, could locate the place at night without even the benefit of modern street signs. Indeed, the musicians themselves were often confused about where exactly John Brown's farm was. Multi-instrumentalist Chico Vega described it as being in Virginia, and guitarist Mike Jackson recalled it being in West Virginia rather than in its true Western Maryland location. The 500 private cars and 20 buses that went to the lodge in 1951 and had found their way to John Brown's farm had accomplished no mean feat. The winding roads, monotonous woods, and lack of lighting and landmarks made for a perplexing journey. Indeed, one clever nickname for the farm, coined by an attendee and her friends from nearby Washington, D.C. was, "You can't find it." But find it they did, year after year. Based on my own difficulties in locating the farm, one of my early questions of interviewees was simply, how did you get to John Brown's farm? The initial answer was often something jovial like Rose Williams' "best way we can," or Edwina Mason's "whatever was moving," or Tyrone Hensley's "anything that was smoking, I was on it." Reginald Johnson described John Bishop's annual marketing strategy. He would try to bring in a very big name act around Easter as a lead-in to the rest of the season. In the summer, everybody from Pennsylvania, from the tri-state area, came to see those entertainers. Al Baylor related that there regularly was a convoy of cars from Charlestown to John Brown's farm. Sylvia Stanton added, kids would meet at Fisherman's Hall and car up to go to the farm. They'd fill one car, take off, fill another, and take off. Charlestown native Diane Power Williams confessed, I started sneaking in at a very early age of 17. People would drop by my house and pick me up, and probably about 6 of us would get in the car and go together. We would always go carloads. Ruth McDaniel of Charlestown recalled a not uncommon occurrence. You'd come down here to town as everybody else was leaving. You'd say, where is everybody? And somebody would answer, well, they're all gone over to John Brown's farm. And you'd say, well, let me see if I can find a ride to go. And that was the way it was. Jean Lee Roberts, also from Charlestown, often got stuck functioning as a designated driver. If I couldn't find another way, then I would drive. I didn't really want to drive. A lot of times I would leave town early so I wouldn't have to drive, but then I'd end up having to drive somebody's car back because they'd done partied too much. And I didn't want to drive because I wanted to party too. Russell Roper said of his Charlestown taxi service, we had 2 cabs and we made a lot of trips back and forth to John Brown's farm. And on the night they had dances. Janet Jeffries lived in a rural area on Berryville Pike near the Virginia-West Virginia state line. Being the country girl that I am, what I would do on a Saturday evening was go down the highway and thumb a ride at Charlestown. And believe it or not, anybody that I caught a ride with, my father knew. So I'd catch a ride to Charlestown and meet up with several of my friends to go to John Brown's farm. The contingent from the west, Kearneysville, Martinsburg, and Shepherdstown, sometimes would meet by carloads of folks coming up from the south. James Taylor of Charlestown explained about the route along Sandy Hook Road. Sometimes after a heavy rain, the road that we usually traveled to the farm would get washed out, and we had to go through Shepherdstown on into Sharpsburg and to a right on Harper's Ferry Road. He can remember this 50 years later. And we had to take that route into the farm. That was the long way around, but we wanted to get there. As an adult, Lawrence Bailey served as the first Black assistant director of the United States Conference of Mayors. He also functioned at the White House in a prestigious and influential position as deputy assistant for President Jimmy Carter. As a teenager, however, Bailey worked summers at the Goose Creek Golf Club in Leesburg, Virginia. At the end of his Saturday shifts, he would dash out to the parking lot and hop in his 1951 Plymouth. He detailed, I would change into my dancing clothes in the car and make a beeline to John Brown's farm. Freddie Lee Gardan of Charlestown drove his chrome and tail fin 1957 Chevy Bel Air to John Brown's farm. One of the ladies in the neighborhood would let no one other than Freddie drive her daughters there and back. He recalled that when he pulled up in front of the house and honked for the girls to come out, their mom would say, "Who's driving that car? Step out and let me see you." And Freddie would oblige, and the girls were free to go. The Hagerstown convoy was somewhat smaller than Charlestown's, but they too found various and ingenious ways to get to the dances. Reginald Johnson said, "We didn't have as many cars going down, but every one of those cars had 5 to 8 people in it. If you wanted to ride, you paid 50 cents for gas." Johnson continued, "People in Hagerstown would start planning on Monday to go down to John Brown's farm on the weekend. People would say to somebody driving down, 'Hold my seat, man, because I'm going.' You have those several days to hustle up your $3 for the $2 ticket, the 50 cents for gas, and for a little something to eat and drink while you were there." Beverly Johnson Owens Gaither of Hagerstown said, "We always found a way to get the $3 to go to the dances. I would babysit, I collected soda bottles, put them in a wagon, and took them to the store to get the 3-cent deposit on them." Dora Roy Yates, she was one of the best dancers there, clearly appreciated the value of $1 and saying, "As far as Mr. John Bishop," that's the booking agent, "he had all the good people that come in there. And what you expected of them is exactly what you got. It was worth our money. Our money back then was hard to get and you had to save. As your mama said, you want to go, you better get your money." So we got our money. And then when it up to maybe $3 or $4 or $5, it was only because they had the bigger bands, but we got our money and we got our money's worth. There are more stories about how people got there. And then I wanted to shift over. Oh boy. Let's see. I think I'm going to skip ahead, but the ride home could be challenging as well. To skip ahead, the events were first-class affairs. People generally dressed well and came to dance and socialize, not to get into trouble, but the natural volatility of masses of energetic young people, coupled with the presence of an abundance of alcohol, were certain to result in a number of fights. And yet at the same time, virtually everyone interviewed said they never felt the least bit threatened. Thus, it seems if you wanted to get into a fight, you could. If you wanted to stay away from them, you did. Leonard Harris recalled that characteristically, people would get a few drinks in them and have a ball. The demeanor and policies of John Bishop, the booking agent, and Maynard Henderson, the on-site watchman there, set an orderly tone to the events. Bishop carried himself in a paternal and businesslike fashion. Leonard Harris clarified, "When you went to one of Bishop's dances, you took care of business because he set an example." Laverne Bishop's memory of her father's typical cautionary address to clubgoers was, "You're welcome to come in so long as you act like a lady or like a gentleman, but if you don't, you gotta go." Maynard Henderson could be more threatening as needed. Junior Henderson noted that his uncle carried a gun and that his attitude towards the attendees was, "You're gonna act right or you're not gonna come back here no more." Was there potential for interracial animosities at the dances? Dora Roy Yates minimized that notion in saying, "There was always some white people there, but we all came there for a purpose, to dance and have a good time and get something to eat, get in the car and come back home. It wasn't none of that other friction. Where the friction was, we kept it out. We didn't come up like that, so we didn't need that, and we don't need it now." Yates additionally noted there were a few fights because if you started a fight inside, you would walk completely off the grounds and you were not permitted to come back to the grounds. And if decorum, admonition, or threat of expulsion weren't sufficiently persuasive, then up would step Bishop's paid security guards, full-time Washington County Sheriff's Deputy Bill Mason, and under him, a number of full-time assistant deputies. During the John Brown's Farm era, the sheriffs of Washington County, Edward Rowland and Charles Price, grasped the wisdom of having Black deputies on staff, especially when it came to matters such as policing dances at the farm. While patrolling the property, Bill Mason and the other deputies were considered on duty and had the authority to make arrests. They wore their uniforms, carried guns, and had a special assistant, Mason's black and tan German Shepherd. According to Greg Bruce Johnson, a former sheriff's deputy who worked later with Mason and another deputy, Frank Keyes, if necessary, Mason would turn the dog loose on an unruly person and he'd take a chunk out of your ass. Current Washington County Sheriff Doug Mullendorf said of Mason, he was like a big likable bear, but he could get the job done. And so that patrolling kept it peaceful. It was just a lovely, lively scene. And here's this a segment about the journey home. Now, a little bit later, let's see how I'm doing for time. Oh, good shape. We'll talk a little bit more about what people experienced at the dance. dances, and then also a couple of vignettes of some of the biggest stars that played there. The journey home. Catherine, do you want to jump in here? We rolling? Would you like to say something?
I've just been enjoying listening to the stories. Thank you. You know, talking about this area, if you've not been through these hills, it really can be a confusion to find one's way. Even though the roads don't seem to intersect that much, but they do like to wind their way around the hills. And in my own research here in Harper's Ferry, it seems that almost every little nook and cranny has its own little hidden story where people have been gathering.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you found this one tucked away back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a great place filled with so much rich history. So thank you.
Okay.
You also, I think, brought up a point that we talk a lot about in Harper's Ferry history, or maybe perhaps should talk about a little more. You're talking about the end of segregation as actually causing some heartache, a sense of loss in the African American community. In order to gain integrated schools, in order to achieve that equality, there's also something that's being given up, and that is this positive Black space that has been developed for generations. In Harper's Ferry, we see that as Storer College, which stood on the hill here for so many years, and then loses so much of its funding when schools are integrated and will close within a year of Brown v. Board. And it's a loss to that community. It's a loss to our entire community, but we gain the bigger prize, I suppose, of integration. But I think, as you so well stated, sometimes we get we're so excited about this idea of integration, of achieving that we forget these other sacrifices that were made to get there. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I've more on that, and you can clearly tell how I can get bogged down on all this. But yeah, that the Elks were particularly aware of all those dynamics, and they were part of the reason they appreciated Brown was that he saw the promise that the Elks can see, still work towards, that if the United States continued in slavery, then the concept of democracy and liberty becomes undermined, and then you may have to go to an aristocracy or some kind of tyranny. And we don't want that, but if segregation and discrimination continue, then it does begin to make people question the liberty without really thinking about what would it be like to live in a society where I'm not free to choose my profession, to choose my friends, to choose my religion, to choose all these other things. So, well, if I might then, I'll jump ahead to the journey home. As each event's final song came to a close, the lights came on and the worn out dancers began to locate their ride mates to head for home. There were still more adventures to come, however. Until I heard the next several travel stories, I had wondered exactly what James Taylor meant once when during a group discussion, he interjected, "Coming back home was the rough part." Daniel Jackson elucidated, "The only problem we had was coming back from John Brown's farm. People would miss that curve down by Sandy Hook, and all landed in the Potomac River. They all landed right there. So if you couldn't find somebody, you knew they were down in the river." Henry Ingram and another white friend once left John Brown's farm following an afternoon of card playing with the caretaker Maynard Henderson. As they headed southbound, they sideswiped an oncoming bus full of elks on the way to the farm. As Ingram described it, one of us got over too far and we bumped fenders pretty good. As the drivers of both vehicles stopped to inspect the damage, Ingram said he was scared to death at the thought of being confronted by a mass of potentially angry Black people. As it turned out, everything was cordial. The Black Sheriff's Deputy Bill Mason was quickly dispatched with his German Shepherd from his service at John Brown's farm to help sort things out. Upon his arrival, Mason assured the still jittery Ingram, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." The road leading northward could be equally treacherous. Gilbert Buss Everline was a lineman for Potomac Edison in the 1950s. Everline recalled being summoned multiple times to come straighten up or replace a power pole standing dangerously near an S-curve on the macadam road, which had been crashed into by inebriated revelers leaving John Brown's farm. Isabel Johnson, in her 90+ years, she just died here a year or two ago, has never had a driver's license, but one dark night she had to serve as a designated driver for the trip home from John Brown's farm. Johnson recollected that her cousin Robert liked to drink Maynard Henderson's homemade wine, but would sometimes overdo it. On one such occasion, following a dance, she said, Robert got in the driver's seat to drive home, but slumped over the steering wheel, which began honking the horn. I asked Robert, what are you doing? And he said, I'm tuning up my girlfriend out in the field. There was nobody in the field. He was seeing things. At that point, Ms. Johnson, though having only a learner's permit, barked at Robert, get your ass out from behind that wheel. And he obeyed. She slid into the driver's seat and maneuvered the car the dozen or so miles over the dark and winding roads north to Boonesboro. From that point, Robert proved sober enough to drive the remaining miles to Hagerstown. Concerning one particularly hair-raising ride back to Charlestown, Jeannie Roberts recalled the curvy roads, the river on one side and a mountain on the other side. I had to drive somebody else's car back and its brakes had gone. And all I got thinking about was, would I have to run into the mountain if that car doesn't give out? Joe Dixon remembers catching a ride from John Brown's farm to Hagerstown with the driver who was so drunk that we got out at Boonesboro and thumbed a ride back with another car going north. Dixon said that on several occasions, I got a ride back to Hagerstown at the end of the night with Sheriff Bill Mason, with his dog breathing in my ear from the back seat. Wendell Scott was a former moonshine ridge runner who in 1953 became America's first Black NASCAR driver. His skills could have come in handy for some of the dancers' trips back home from John Brown's farm. Hagerstown's Wallace Goose Brooks remembered that after a dance was over, some person or other would shout, I'll beat you back to Hagerstown, and off they flew. According to Brooks, people would pass each other like crazy, even on hills and curves. On one occasion, the vehicle immediately in front of Brooks' carload spun out, flipped over, and came to a rest on an embankment. As Brooks and his friends approached, one of the women in their car screamed and for some reason flung her door open, hitting the overturned car and creating even more mayhem. Somehow most John Brown's farm attendees made it back safe and sound, though not infrequently still a little tipsy. Beverly Owens Gaither noted, we would get 7 or 8 in a car coming back to Hagerstown and get to town about dawn. Then we would put on the radio, get out of the car, and start dancing again in the street. Well, another fun thing. Okay, I have in the book, I found documentation, sometimes was not always easy to get, but I had to exclude some performers at John Brown's farm that have a strong hunch really were there, but they didn't meet the criteria. I had to have 2 people not from the same family, that had to have a vivid memory, something like that. But I was able to document so far almost 70 performers that were there at John Brown's farm. And let me just read you a partial list of this. It was 5, let's see, what do we got? 5 of the top 10 singers as listed by Rolling Stone magazine played at John Brown's farm. 4 of the initial 8 inductees in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame played at John Brown's farm. And here's a partial list then. Chuck Berry, James Brown, Ray Charles, Chubby Checker, the Coasters, the Crystals, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, the Drifters, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, the Impressions, the Isley Brothers, Etta James, B.B. King, Eartha Kitt, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, Little Anthony and the Imperials, Little Richard, Clyde McPhatter, Wilson Pickett, the Platters, Lloyd Price, Lou Rawls, Otis Redding, the Shirelles, Joe Tex, Ike and Tina Turner, Junior Walker and the All-Stars, Dionne Warwick, Mary Wells, the Queen of Motown, and Jackie Wilson. So I'd like to read just a little blurb that I wrote about Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson was a knockout artist in both senses of the term. Elvis Presley and Michael Jackson are among the many admiring artists who were knocked out by his talent. And who knows how many hecklers were knocked out by the former Golden Gloves boxer's fists. Wilson generally challenged his passion into music, however. Whether the musical vehicle was a dramatic ballad or a kick and rumba, his brilliant tenor and athletic showmanship filled the platform. Wilson grew up in Depression-era Detroit, the product of a troubled father and a churched mother. He wobbled back and forth between those two sets of genes throughout his life. He wound his way through a gospel group, 2 stints in the juvenile justice system where he learned to box, into fatherhood, and on to secular music. In 1953, while still in his teens, Wilson was recruited by the Dominoes to fill the spot of the popular Clyde McPhatter, who was leaving to form his own group, the Drifters. During Wilson's tenure with the Dominoes, their biggest hit was the schmaltzy ballad, St. Therese of the Roses. Wilson next was signed as a solo act at Decca Records subsidiary Brunswick. His first release was Reet Petite, a perfect showcase for Wilson's strengths, but stalling in its climb up the Hot 100 to number 62. 29 years later, based upon the strength of a charming BBC claymation accompaniment, Reet Petite shot to number 1 in the United Kingdom in 1986, 2 years after Wilson's death. That song was followed up by Lonely Teardrops. Treat yourself sometime to a video of Wilson performing that chart-topping song on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. Wilson's already blazing magnetism flares up several notches when on the second chorus, he drops from the staircase to the floor below onto his knees. In 1961, Wilson had a career setback, to say the least, when someone, depending on which story you believe, possibly a jealous girlfriend, shot him twice. One bullet lodged inoperably near his spine, and the other took out a kidney. In 1963, the miraculously amended Wilson took the big band Twister Baby Workout to another number 1 R&B, number 5 Hot 100. After a brief lull in popularity, Wilson recorded the 1967 song about which one person remarked, "Don't play that song around the Statue of Liberty, she might start dancing." That song, Higher and Higher, became one of Wilson's 46 R&B and 24 US top 40 hits. Wilson died in 1984 after spending 9 years in a coma as a result of an onstage heart attack. Later that year, with Quincy Jones standing at his side, Michael Jackson dedicated his Album of the Year Grammy for Thriller to Jackie Wilson. Let's you in there just for a bit, Catherine.
That's really impressive. It's so strange to think of this tiny little place hidden in the hills being such truly a world stage for so many people. That's wonderful. About how many years are we looking at here? How many years was the hall in operation?
About 15. When you get around to 1951 or so, it's pretty murky. I think they tended to be local, maybe DC and Baltimore, little 3-piece jazz groups. And so some of the local people, the white people in Dargan, were invited, and they came and attended those dances. And then as Mr. Bishop got involved, then he was already booking fairly big bands into his nightclub on the Virginia side of the river. And then he was able to hook up with a segregated beach, Carr's Beach, over in Annapolis, Maryland, where they would have these gigantic Sunday afternoon dances at 3 o'clock. Black people from the North and South would jam the highways to go to that beach. And then under the pavilion, they would have these dances. Count Basie and just all sorts of people would come to those things. And so that's a Sunday afternoon dance. If Saturday night or Sunday night was open, then that booking agent, Rufus Mitchell, would talk to Mr. Bishop and say, "Hey, I've got, for instance, Little Richard is free Saturday night. Do you want it?" And so Mr. Bishop would get busy making up posters from Globe Poster in Baltimore and tack them up on telephone poles and barbershops in well over 100 Black communities, large and small, within about a 50-mile radius of John Brown's farm. And people would come by the hundreds and hundreds. I was told that you might see 400 or 500 people inside the dance hall and another 400 to 500 people just that didn't go in. They just partied outside or played softball or hung out and just had a ball. A place of liberty. One person described it as it was a place where there was no law. And so in a sense, law and liberty can be somewhat opposites there. You have the freedom to go so far, and then if you're breaking some sort of law, then you might have to go into some kind of custody. But for so many Black people in this area in the 1950s and 60s, they had to sort of pretend. They went out into white society and worked sometimes as domestics. It could be construction jobs or something, but always kind of using what both Paulus Dunbar and W.B. Du Bois talked as wearing the veil, the mask. And then so to go down there and experience a Black entrepreneurial experience, the promoter, the dancers, the musicians, the Captain Mason and patrolling the property, all blacks. And well, like they said, blacks were comprised of the vast majority of the people at the dances, but there were always some white people there. Some people said, yeah, I taught one of our white friends to dance, and just some beautiful things going on there. So for me, this farm asks certain sorts of questions. So for instance, in the pursuit of justice, what actually works and what is counterproductive? What is an appropriate and proportional response to injustice? So you've got John Brown saying that slavery is itself a capital offense, that it would be the equivalent of a kidnap, where a person is not free to do his or her own bidding. They're subject to someone else's ownership or captivity of them. And so he finally reckoned that in the lack of law out in Kansas, that he would take the law into his own hands, and had 5 people, pro-slavery people, killed at his hand. He didn't kill them himself, but he had a warrant for his arrest. He was a wanted man the rest of his life. But he thought that if finally, after he was caught and tried, that there was a national mourning for what was about to happen to John Brown, and Victor Hugo and some of the transcendentalist writers, Thoreau, and others pleaded for John Brown's life. They said, John Brown is not wrong. America is wrong. And if John Brown is to be hung, then he may make the gallows as glorious as the cross of Jesus Christ, and that a nation must divide over the death of John Brown. You have to be for what he's for, or against him, what he's for. And the nation did divide, and within months, the Civil War had begun with the Union troops singing about John Brown's body. If I might here, I think we can, as we come down to the end of things, I have another quote by W.B. Du Bois. And again, this ties in with what I've been hoping to say, the connectivity between John Brown, between Du Bois's memorialization of Brown, and then the Elks wanting to have that specific property when they were looking for inspiration for reigniting the modern civil rights movement, and then to have all these young Black people, primarily from Front Royal, Virginia, all the way up to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, over to Baltimore and DC, for a 6,000 square mile area, weekend after weekend of the summers from 1950 to 1965, these young people were actually having an opportunity to experience that liberty. And here, this is the reading now from Du Bois. He's talking up to white culture, but he says, your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have brought our 3 gifts and mingled them with yours. A gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. The gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done it. The third, a gift of the Spirit. Around us, the history of the land is centered for thrice 100 years. Out of the nation's heart, we have called all that was best to throttle and subdue all that was worse. Fire and blood, prayer and sacrifice have billowed over this people, and they have found peace only in the altars of the God of capital R right. Nor has our gift of the Spirit been merely passive. Actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. We fought their battles, shared their sorrow, mingled our blood with theirs, and generation after generation have pleaded with a headstrong, careless people to despise not justice, mercy, and truth, lest the nation be smitten with a curse. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth the giving? Is not this work and striving? Would America have been America without her Negro people? I'm going to throw up real quick on a shared screen. I think I know how to get back out of here this time. This is the book cover, The Family of R&B, America's Popular Music from Jamestown to James Brown. And it is a story of the music that white and Black people brought to America. And as we see these musical forms coming forward, blacks and whites were playing a similar music in the American Southeast. There were educated Creoles and blacks from New Orleans that some of them went abroad to study in Europe and study classical music even, but they brought some of the island rhythms that were filtering from the Caribbean into New Orleans, then were taken by these Creoles primarily to Europe. And so in the middle Romantic period, you're seeing the influence of American blacks on European classical music. And along with the Broadway and vaudeville of New York City, and eventually Jewish songwriters like Burt Bacharach and Hal David, Jerry Goffin and Carole King, Lieber and Stoller, who wrote You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, that we can see American popular music merging more and more through black and white people, artists, channels, clubs, and it has become in one lifetime. I was born in 1949. In 1948, this music was still called race music. It was renamed rhythm and blues. It was black people calling it race music, by the way, renamed by Jerry Wexler to call it rhythm and blues. And by the 2018 Winter Olympics in Seoul, Korea, the closing ceremonies there were several K-pop groups, Korean pop. They were doing American R&B. So this music that brought people together on John Brown's farm went out from places like that to integrate America's youth experiences. And let's see if I can bring myself back now. Oh, I'm so bad at this. Oh, there it is. That America's youth, especially once Brown versus Board went through, and that some of the high schools at least got integrated immediately, you've got black and white kids in the same marching band, on the same track team, on the same bus going to a football game. They're talking about music. They start listening to the same music. They start buying the same music. They start supporting these artists. And then these artists outgrew little places on the Chitlin circuit like John Brown's farm, and they started appearing in movies and major venues and television. And from there, it's become the world's music. But here's another, so the vision of John Brown, the picking up on the vision and person of John Brown by the Black Elks for the Civil Rights Movement, the liberty of the dancers and musicians as these young dancers were egging these musicians on, that you were seeing James Brown trying songs out on these dancers to see how the dancers would respond to them. And a lot of those people said, I didn't even know who John Brown was. To me, he was just music for me to go to a dance. I found out later and I appreciate him. But this music then has had perhaps as much or more than a war, than legislation, that this music, as the arts often do, have become a way for people to integrate and to appreciate each other. But I think you will find, if you choose to buy my next book coming out pretty soon, it was an outtake from the first book, but it will be seen then that blacks and whites work together to create this American music. And the joy and the artistry that we have, if we can pull that into our dealings on a personal level and on a corporate level, that it is all the values of John Brown's farm that need to be revisited and extrapolated into our future if we are to ever experience the somewhat fleeting sense of liberty that those young dancers would have on weekends at John Brown's farm, but that could become part of our corporate existence and something that we would all rejoice to see the fulfillment of a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the idea that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
A powerful wish and thesis, and I look forward to the new book. When are we expecting that to be available?
Well, I may go to the printers as little as a week, so maybe next month. And I think you were possibly going to say that the first book, John Brown to James Brown, then is available at all the area bookstores, but certainly at the bookshop at Harper's Ferry, yeah, or online at Amazon.com. And I'm thankful to everyone who has bought the book. It's still not the big deal that I think it ought to be, that I think this place could be memorialized as some kind of an attraction. So can we imagine, I can easily, that Harper's Ferry and John Brown's farm, just 5 miles apart, as a hub of Black history in the United States. But it's not just Black history, it's American history.
Right. So the John Brown farm today is, I believe, a historic site that has been preserved. So you can go out and walk this land. The farmhouse is preserved. You're describing the hall is still being present, but not in any means open to the public for inspection. And is there any interpretation of this history on the site that you know of?
There's not. And so the Lynn family has, for pushing 50 years, have owned that part or all of that property, and they're aware of the historical significance of all of its pieces. There may be a few more designations that they might choose to get, and at that point, people would be a lot of grant organizations want to see certain historical designations first before they're going to commit to those things. But yeah, the interpretation is possible there because the buildings, the old dance hall still stands, as well as the restored farmhouse.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for capturing this story, not just of Washington County and Harpers Ferry history, but surely of national history. This new view into John Brown's enduring legacy. His soul marches on, as the song goes, I suppose.
Very good.
Any closing words as we wrap this up this evening?
No, thank you for the opportunity, Catherine. And you've been a peach all along and taken a chance on me in this book for years now. And I think we'll all be able to rejoice if this captures the attention of Oprah Winfrey, or I don't know who. I actually have a book in the hands of her longtime virtual spouse there. But then COVID hit, and they have several big houses, and he could be in a whole different house than the book. But I have that hope.
Well, that would be a divine goal to see manifested.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us this lovely summery Sunday. This is a very busy week for Authors Reading Aloud. We will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock, again on the Facebook page. And I know I've been sharing a lot of history with you over the past few weeks. We're actually going to shift gears and start bringing you some novels and fiction. So join me tomorrow evening for Natalina Rice and her story Dark Feathers, which is a dark fantasy novel. We will be here on Thursday with Catherine Anderson, who is actually a historian who specializes in the history of asylums and mental illness, but she's written a novel based on her research called Hospital Hill. And then on Saturday, my friend Richard Smith, a public historian in Concord, Massachusetts, who specializes in Henry Thoreau and other literary figures, will be talking not only about his written works, but about the work of writing for Applewood Books and the various short biographies that they put out, of which he is the author of quite a number. So quite a busy week for us. During this summer week, we hope that you'll be able to enjoy some of the programs. And as always, thank you so much for supporting authors and bookshops. There should be a link to purchase this book if you wish in the video description. And we'll see you again soon. Good night.
Good night.